I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's discussion I am talking with Joe Schmid, who is the founder of the Majesty of Reason philosophy YouTube channel. On Joe's channel, he talks about the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and more. He currently identifies as an agnostic. He also writes academic papers, and he has even published a book on critical thinking in philosophy. As you may have gathered from the title of this video, me and Joe talk about agnosticism, categories of agnosticism, what is agnosticism, and we also delve into other topics such as atheism, the existence of God, critical thinking, and what makes a good philosopher. If you guys aren't familiar with Joe's channel already, then I would highly recommend it. He talks in depth about so many different topics, and he also doesn't take himself too seriously, which is something that I really like about his kind of tone and his style of video making. Also, to support this channel as much as you can, please leave a like if you genuinely enjoy this discussion, and subscribe if you're new here for more content on philosophy and psychology and literature, book reviews, and also there is my Patreon to help the channel going and help me get better equipment and just maintain what I do here. So if you appreciate my work, then you can feel free to check out my Patreon and sign up. Lastly, remember to comment your thoughts on what we say throughout the discussion. If you have any, let's say, constructive criticisms of what myself or Joe say throughout, if you just have any cool ideas to add to the discussion or just anything at all, remember to comment your thoughts. And share the video as well to, any groups who like philosophy, or, a friend who likes philosophy or whatever, to help Joe out as well with his YouTube channel and to get as many people as possible to watch his cool content. With all of this said, I hope you enjoy the video. Cheers. Joe, thanks for coming on the channel. I've been waiting for this for a while now. I mean, we organized this, a couple months ago. And yeah, ever since I've oh God, what to ask? But I had to contain myself. We have a topic, and I'm just going to quiz you on agnosticism and a bit of atheism. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the channel. Could you introduce yourself to any viewers who may not know what you're about and what you do? Go into some of the work that you do in philosophy, and of course, as I said, your channel, and what sort of stuff do you post? Yep.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this as always. I love these sorts of discussions because I love philosophy. So like you said, I'm Joe. I do both popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. So on the scholarly level, I write books and articles and things like that. People can check that stuff out on my Phil Papers profile or my website, josephschmid.com or whatever. And then on the popular level, I have mainly my YouTube channel. So that's Majesty of Reason. And yeah, I make lecture videos of my own on there, and I also host discussions between different philosophers on a bunch of different topics. Mainly it's philosophy of religion and God's existence, but also I go into other areas like metaphysics, philosophy of time, ethics. So it's all around philosophy with an emphasis on philosophy of religion, which is kind of like my work more generally as well.
Yeah, see, I mean, you cover a lot of ground, and your videos are really in depth as well. There's one video, I think it's like a compilation of videos, I think it is, but one of your videos is over 10 hours long or something. I love how you just compiled it together, just that's the full package. There you go, that's all you need. I thought that was quite funny, actually. I mean, that is one part of your content that I personally enjoy, how for you it's not this completely serious investigation. It's it is, but it's also, you're not afraid to kind of have a laugh and have a joke as well,
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that makes you really unique as well. And also we're the same age, and I look at your work and I'm just damn, I'm always so impressed with your interviews and your discussions, with Capturing Christianity and Cosmic Skeptic or who have you. You just do some really cool work, and I just admire I just admire everything that you contribute. I just find it so interesting, and it's just so cool, man. So I just want to congratulate you on that, I guess.
Well, thank you. I mean, I
Yeah,
like I say in lots of videos, like the goal is to serve people, and so when people say that it is
yeah,
serving them in the manner that you are saying, is it's always wonderful to hear. It's like the primary goal of my channel, so
all
it's
right.
always great to hear.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. So let's get straight into it. So I have you on today to discuss agnosticism. So just for those who are vaguely familiar or perhaps don't know what agnosticism is, could you give like a definition, just a working definition, what you think is most useful?
Yeah. So I'll be talking about these terms as philosophers use them, and as I think is the most helpful way to use them. So agnosticism can really be applied in any domain, right? So we can ask, here's a funny question to ask: how many, or is the number of stars in existence even or odd? Well, I have no clue, and I'm going to submit that neither do you. So I think we all probably should be agnostic on that question of whether the number of stars is even as opposed to odd, right? So we can be agnostic on a bunch of different sorts of questions in different domains. So that leaves the question, well, what is this being agnostic about? What is that? Well, generally, it just means suspending judgment on some matter, or withholding belief one way or another. So whenever we have a proposition or a statement or view, for instance, the view that the number of stars is even, right? We can believe it to be true. We can take it to represent reality. We can believe it to be false. We can take it not to represent reality. Reality is not the way that it describes. You are affirming that reality is not the way that it describes. Or you could just refrain from believing either way. You neither believe that it's true nor believe that it's false, right? So you suspend judgment on the matter. You don't believe one way or the other, that it's true or that it's false. So that is what agnosticism in its core is. And it's applied, like I said, to different propositions or views. So you could be agnostic about the nature of time. Maybe you're agnostic on whether or not all times exist or whether or not just the present moment exists, things like that. You could be agnostic on that. I think for present purposes, we're talking about agnosticism with respect to God's existence, right? So then given some characterization of God as like, a perfect, omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe, something like that, given some description of God, the agnostic is going to say, I withhold judgment in whether or not that God exists, right? So you neither believe that God exists, nor do you believe that God doesn't exist. You suspend judgment. So yeah, that's a rough and ready characterization. There are different kinds of agnostics. I don't know if you want to get into that because
Yeah,
there are
no,
different ways.
yeah, I'd love to get into that. Yeah, because I feel like agnosticism as a term, it's, people who are engaged with this topic generally kind of understand what it is, and they might be like, well, maybe they don't understand agnosticism more than kind of the term in of itself, which is fair enough. Like, it's not a very common term, generally
Yeah.
speaking. Like, unless you really kind of go into the topic, or unless you only listen to the New Atheists or something like that. So I'm a guy about nuances, and I feel like it's really important. Well, in philosophy, especially, to give credit where credit is due to the nuance, because if you're going to generalize and kind of treat it with not much seriousness, then you're not really going to get to the heart of the issue. So yeah, I'd love for you to go into different types of agnosticism. I also want to shout out your video on agnosticism, because you did make one. I think it's like an hour and a half long or something, and
It's one
and
of
you
my
really,
favorites.
yeah, you really kind of go into it there. So just before we get into that, I would also recommend the viewer, if they're after this video, if they're really interested in also arguments. I think it's arguments also pertaining to God and against. So yeah, that video is really cool. So anyway, take it away.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess before I mention the different kinds of agnostics, we should at least get clear at least how I'm using the terms for theist and atheist.
Right.
So on the question of God's existence, right, a theist would be someone who believes that God exists, and then an atheist is someone who believes that God does not exist. So they represent the world as being such that God does not exist. And contrariwise for the theist. And then the atheist or the agnostic suspends judgment one way or another. So they're kind of in like that middle ground between the theist and the atheist. So then there are different ways that you can be an agnostic, right? So all of them suspend judgment on the matter of God's existence, but there are different ways that you can suspend judgment. One of them you might think is just saying, well, like, look, it's in principle knowable one way or the other. Like in principle, you can have really strongly justified beliefs one way or another, either in atheism or in theism. And in principle, if those beliefs are appropriately justified and true, they're going to amount to knowledge. You can say in principle that might be possible, but just given the person's epistemic situation, that is, given the evidence that they've looked into and the reasons and their experiences and so on, given all that, they just it's the evidence and reasons are roughly counterbalanced for and against God's existence. That might be one way that you can be an agnostic. So because of that, they'd suspend judgment on the matter. But the precise way in which they suspend judgment, or I guess the reason why they suspend judgment, is that, the reasons roughly counterbalance one another. But other people, there are different kinds of agnostics, right? So other people might say, no, the reason why I suspend judgment is because no one can know in principle, and you can't have strongly justified beliefs one way or another. And so because no one can know whether or not God exists, and you can't have these strongly justified beliefs one way or another, we should all be agnostic, or at least the person who is aware of the considerations that make it such that we cannot know that God exists. At least they should be agnostic. So, there are these two different kinds of agnostics. The people who say it's unknowable in principle, you can't have a strongly justified belief one way or another in principle, versus the agnostic who says, yeah, in principle, that's possible. There's nothing preventing that. But given their epistemic situation, given the reasons of which they're aware, the arguments of which they're aware, their experiences, they just find the evidential scales for theism and atheism roughly counterbalance, something like that. And we can get more precise in talking about credence, right? So philosophers make a distinction between belief and credence. Belief is kind of like an on-off switch, like you either believe something or you believe it's negation, or you believe neither. You suspend judgment. So it's kind of like, though, you've got those three discrete categories, whereas credence is like a range from 0 to 100%, right? So you can be 50% confident in something. You could be 75% confident in something. You could be 95% confident in something. So it's like your level of confidence. So, some agnostics might be at roughly 50-50 one way or another, whether or not God exists. Some might be, within some range between 40% and 60%. It all just kind of depends. But I think the best way to carve the different kinds of agnostics is along those lines of whether or not they think it's knowable in principle, or whether or not in principle it's possible to have strongly justified beliefs one way or another. And I think I said this, but I fall into that camp where, I think in principle, I don't see any barrier to someone coming to knowledge one way or another. But at least for me, and the reasons that I'm aware and that I've looked into, the evidence and reasons seem roughly counterbalanced. So yeah, those are different kinds of agnostics that I think can at least conceptually empower people, to think more clearly about these sorts of issues.
Yeah, no, thanks for your breakdown of that. I mean, I feel like agnosticism isn't really paid much attention to in the more casual, I guess, arena of philosophy. Like generally, like, people might say, oh, agnostic, like surely you can pick one side. Like, it's kind of being like, Switzerland, like surely they do have a preference for things. They're just pretending that they don't. I don't know. Like that's kind of the general claim whereby, the average person is like, surely they're not perfectly balanced, right? I mean, what would you say to a critic such as that?
Yeah, so I mean, this does get into like tricky waters about how we what's the relationship between credence and belief. So importantly, right, credences can change. You can have like slight changes in credence while still retaining a given belief. So, for instance, suppose I look at the weather app today and it's telling me about the weather tomorrow, and I know that this is a very reliable weather app. It says that there is a 95% chance of rain tomorrow. I'm going to form the belief that it's going to rain tomorrow, and I'm going to prepare for that. I'm going to pack an umbrella for my trip. I'm going to, etc. Now, suppose at midnight tonight, right before I go to bed, I look at the weather app again, and then it's gone down from 95 to 90%. Oh, so like the credence level that I assigned, the proposition that it's going to rain tomorrow, because I'm appropriately responsive to the evidence, namely the evidence of this app telling me things, I lower my confidence that it's going to rain tomorrow. I lower ever so slightly from 95% to 90%. But I still believe it's going to rain, right? I still represent the world as being such that it's going to rain tomorrow. And I still pack my umbrella, right? So we can have these minor changes in credence while still retaining the belief in question, or just while still retaining our belief status, for instance, suspending belief on a given matter. So, for some people, maybe it's like, I mean, I don't know, maybe for them it's like perfectly counterbalanced. Their level of confidence in God's existence and God's non-existence, maybe it's perfectly counterbalanced for them. For other people, maybe it's like roughly 55 to 45, maybe it's roughly 60-40, but they still find themselves not with a sufficiently high degree of confidence to warrant full-blown belief or representing the world as being that way. Maybe they could have slight leanings one way or another. And we get that gets into difficulties like how do we categorize them? Do we categorize them as an agnostic, or do we categorize them as like an agnostic leaning atheist or agnostic leaning theist? I just let the individual kind of describe that for themselves. I mean, I just say as long as you suspend judgment on the matter, as long as you don't full blown believe one way or another, you don't represent the world as being a certain way and like determinately act in light of that, then you're probably going to count as an agnostic, even if you have minor divergences from exactly 50%. So yeah, and I mean, some people, they have their confidence is kind of just like indeterminate among a range, right? So I mean, you're very rarely going to find someone and they're going to say, "Aha, my exact credence in God's existence is 50.67%." Like that's kind of absurd.
Yeah.
So maybe it might be indeterminate among a range. So like just like 0.4 to 0.6, they don't really have a determinate place where they land on that, but they'd still arguably count as agnostic in that sense, so long as they're they suspend judgment one way or another. So there are minor divergences that you can have from exactly like not tipping the balance one way or another, like being on that exact balance. So yeah.
And I think there's sort of an expectation that is put upon agnostics to kind of have that level of like, oh, you have to kind of know how agnostic you are with certainty. But it's like, well, certainty isn't really something that is agreed upon, let's just say, in this kind of area. I mean, at the end of the day, like you were kind of saying, it does depend on the individual. Like it does depend on, like Graham Oppy, he kind of, who I know that you've had interactions with, like I like the fact that he embraces how subjective and how difficult this entire topic is, right? Because at the end of the day, like when we, especially in defining atheism as well, it's like, the individual, you have to kind of give some kind of attention to how the individual psychologically views that word and how it relates to them in how they talk about the subject. Like it's not this black and white thing, and I think that's a really good approach, because on a psychological level, it is a subjective matter in that regard. So a follow-up question to this matter of agnosticism: when you would say sort of about credence and things like that, how does that extend to differing religions? I mean, are you, for example, would you view Islam to the same or a roughly similar extent to be, true or false in that? Like how? Well, I mean, it might be a big question, but I'll see if you can tackle it, in any way. But like, do you have more credit? Do you think there's more credibility in Islam than there is Christianity, Judaism? How do you kind of deal with that question?
That's a great question. So like, let's suppose that someone is like roughly 50-50 in their assessment of the probability of God's existence, given their evidence, given their reasons, and so on. Well, we can look at that sample of the probability space, or that portion of the probability space occupied by God's existence, right? So, 50% of it, and the other 50% is over here, God's non-existence. So we can zoom in on this probability space, and then look at different, more specific hypotheses within this sample space. And we can assign differential credences in here, as you were kind of hinting at, right? We can assign one hypothesis about God, maybe just a bare philosophical theism without any connection to any religions. You might assign that a very high credence, and then any particular religion a super duper low credence because they make super specific claims. Maybe they're highly implausible claims that go against regularities of nature and so on. So yeah, there's leeway for agnostics to have greater and lesser credence in various different religious traditions. Maybe even like, 90% of that probability space in which God exists, maybe 90% of that is Islam for them, or maybe it's Christianity for them, or maybe it's equally spread out among the different range of religions, and so on. Now, I guess for me, I mean, those sorts of assessments are really difficult just because, there's so much evidence to bring to bear from historical evidence, from contextual evidence. even like sociological stuff, and it's an incredibly difficult matter.
Yeah.
I mean, you asked specifically about Islam and Christianity. I mean, I guess I can just report my own sort of credences here, and this might sort of reflect, a biased background because I have a background in Christianity. But I mean, I do think it's sort of supported by my evidence base. Well, anyway, out of the range of religions, I personally have a higher credence, let's just say, in Christianity than at least a pairwise comparison with each of the other alternative religions. And I guess the reason is, while I'm not fully convinced by the case for Jesus's resurrection, I think it's probably one of the most well-attested miracles among the different range of religions. I don't say it's the most, of course, but like there are some serious scholars working today who mount sort of, I guess, cumulative cases based on various historical facts, based on at least alleged appearances of Jesus to the apostles, and the empty tomb, and attestations to the crucifixion and things like that. You could build a kind of cumulative explanatory case here. And while I think that, or while I'm not convinced that such an argument succeeds in showing the truth of Christianity, I, at least by my lights, I haven't come across as good of a case for other sorts of religions. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the basic thrust of my response. But again, this is a highly, like, it just depends on so many different factors, and for a bunch of different people, it's going to reflect their background and their own experiences and so on. So
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's a pretty tough question. Yeah, because that's something that came to mind. It's like, to what extension would agnosticism get to? Like, because there's the matter of, as I said, like religions and interpretations of a particular god. It's like a really messy topic to begin with. Like it's incredibly difficult.
yeah, I mean,
Difficult.
especially when you think about like how like almost each of these individual doctrines, I mean, especially of Christianity, because it's kind of like in the Anglosphere of the English speaking world and etc. But like each of the doctrines has its own like huge literature in philosophy and theology unpacking what it is, discussing objections to it. So like the Trinity, right? There are like dozens of theories of the Trinity on offer, and like
Hmm.
probably thousands of articles written on the subject of the logical problem of the Trinity, right? The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, and yet the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, etc. That's kind of the logical problem. So you seem to violate the transitivity of identity, etc. There's like, I kid you not, this is not a hyperbole, thousands of papers on this topic, right? So it's like, it's so difficult to kind of gain an epistemic purchase here, at least from like an outsider perspective, or for someone who isn't like so immersed in that literature, like one of the active players in the field who's read at least a substantive portion of those thousands of papers. So it's all just so messy. And I mean, I guess that's one thing that I wish people could appreciate more, just how messy truth seeking is, and just how messy all this stuff is, and how difficult it truly is. I mean, at least for me, that inspires a great deal of epistemic humility and caution in approaching these matters. And that's, I mean, I just often see in Twitter, of course, and other places, just a general lack of that kind of epistemic humility. People are just like confidently, with absolute certainty, proclaiming their like very particularized version of Islam or very particularized version of Christianity. I'm like, I don't know how someone could do that, just given the whole range of considerations and debates of which I'm even unaware. Like, how many of you guys have looked into the question of this particular argument written by this one random dude, and there's a little literature spawned by it? Like, very few people have done that, and yet somehow they're able to rule out the possibility that that might change their view or at least impact their confidence. So at least for me, that's one factor, that's at least one chip almost for just generally defaulting towards agnosticism. It's just there's so much, and there's so little that I know, and that all
Yeah.
of us individually knows. There's so
Yeah.
little.
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
almost
it's
absurd if you think about it. I mean,
yeah.
if our salvation is predicated on this, which anyway, it's like, it's almost absurd that we're in such a difficult epistemic situation, but yet coming to the right conclusions, at least by some people's lights, is a necessary condition for avoiding eternal conscious torment, which I just find like, you got to be kidding me. But okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, not to get into this rabbit hole, but like, eternal hell and things like that. I mean, that, that's problematic in itself. And some would argue that, a benevolent God couldn't, condemn somebody to a hell that is infinite, you know, that has all sorts of problems. And, I have my own personal problems with that. And going on from what you were discussing there, like, so when I first got into this topic, of course, I was watching Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris and what have you. I wasn't too impressed with Dennett. I found his book on consciousness to not explain consciousness whatsoever, but I won't go
Consciousness
down there.
explained. Wait, consciousness explained away. So instead of
Yeah, yeah,
consciousness
yeah,
explained,
yeah.
consciousness explained away.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I won't go into that. That's for another time. But yeah, I basically wasn't convinced. I wasn't really impressed with that. But yeah, so what I was getting at was like, it does seem to me that the there are a lot of great thinkers that are popular in the literature. There are we know them in the classical world. There are some really genuine, serious thinkers. And maybe it's an issue, more of an issue nowadays. Perhaps maybe that's the case. But I feel like the most consistent and genuine and hardworking, um, you know, I feel like those kind of thinkers, those kind of philosophers, even psychologists, from what I found, the best kind are those who are not bestsellers, right? And I feel that there's multiple meanings to that, and there's some basic meanings to that. There's some deeper meanings to that, but on a fundamental level, I feel like it's quite clear that our brains aren't meant to deal with rationality and more so emotion and pattern seeking and assumptions, and so it's I don't know. It's funny because if this is a challenge from God, well, I'm kind of intrigued to take up that challenge as you are. I feel and I'm humbled to take up that challenge, but at the same time, I'm wondering, but that challenge is worth lifetimes, so many lifetimes, right? I mean, that's quite a tall order. I mean, even to read all the literature, as you said, on the Trinity would take you bloody ages, right? I mean, I know we're kind of veering into a topic of incredulity of like, God's will and so on, but I feel like this is an important point to make. It's like not only are some of the best thinkers in philosophy, let's just say philosophy right now, are not read to begin with. I mean, I feel that's a big issue, right? But it's also the issue of God's expectation of us to do that work. I mean, look, as I said, I get it, right? I accept the challenge, but at the same time, I feel like that's very. I'm not too keen on that tall order, as I was saying. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to find more plausible versions of religions that are at least like soteriologically inclusivist. By that I mean, um, it is not a condition on salvation that you have some sort of like a necessary and absolutely necessary condition on salvation in that religion, that you have certain explicitly cognitive commitments and doxastic commitments. Um, I mean, precisely because, I mean, firstly, this stuff is so immensely difficult, and getting a grip on it is just so immensely different. And I mean, people have jobs and lives
Yeah,
to live and
yeah,
so on. Like, not everyone is like privileged, not everyone is as privileged as
yeah.
us to be able to go to university and study these sorts of things. It's like, and other people just like die in childhood without having the relevant
Mm.
beliefs. Um and like, are they going to go to hell forever for not accepting? I mean, they were children, they didn't really even get a chance. It's like, so it's difficult. And I mean, because of reasons like that, because I find it implausible that such people would be, condemned to hell for not having the relevant explicit doxastic commitments, I find it implausible that that would be a necessary condition on avoiding hell, things like that. So I like you. I mean, I'm all for embracing the challenge, but I'm also all for recognizing how difficult it is, and um, at least not holding people uber accountable for being unaware of certain arguments that are like published in this highfalutin journal, which is like not even open access, or things like that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then the debates
Yeah,
that ensue therefrom. It's like
yeah,
some people have this 9 to 5 job with like 4 children that they need to take care of, and they don't have the time to read up on this debate and the counter responses in it and so on. um, it's like, are we seriously going to hold them accountable? Well, anyway, it just strains credulity. So yeah.
yeah, yeah, for
I mean, I just
sure.
think we need to do the best that we individually can given our situation in life, right? So we all have different situations in life. If you're just completely ignoring these sorts of questions, and maybe even intentionally ignoring them, and you're not trying to cultivate intellectual and moral virtue where you can and where possible in your life, right? Then you might be accountable and so on, and then that we can start to ask reasonable questions there. But for those who actually are trying to cultivate that virtue and so on, uh, it does strain credulity that they'd be consigned to hell or something like that just because they didn't reach the correct conclusion.
If you have chosen the agnostic position, what is it that would convince you otherwise, essentially, on atheism and theism? Now, again, another big question. I hope you'll pardon my my eagerness to get your thoughts. Um, yeah, well, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a kind of abstract structure to this question. I mean, there's one simple answer, which is like, I don't know what precisely it would take, but there's a general abstract um, formula that we could follow. I don't know if this is the banger type of response that you were looking for, but I mean, listen, I have certain evidential chips on both sides, as I explained in my Why My Agnostic video that
Yeah,
you talked about at the
yeah,
beginning. I have lots of evidential chips on both sides, both for atheism. We could also pick a more specific atheistic hypothesis like naturalism, and on the one hand, and theism on the other. So I have a bunch of different evidential chips that favor each one. So then here's a kind of abstract rule for getting me to start really significantly going one way or another. To get me going towards the theist side, right? You could either take away chips from this side, right? So things that I thought were evidence for atheism, I no longer think are strong evidence for atheism. Or you could reduce the strength of some of the chips on this side. So while I do still think that they're evidential chips favoring atheism, I no longer think that they're as strong as they used to be, right? So that's two ways regarding that. Also, to get me closer to theism, you could increase the number of evidential chips on the theist side, right? So increase this up a little bit. Or you could increase the strength of the existent evidential chips on this side, right? So instead of adding new chips, we take things that I already thought were evidence for theism and then just ratchet up the evidential force of those. Like, oh, wow, that's a lot stronger evidence than I originally thought. So that's kind of the formula for getting me closer to theism, right? So you either remove evidential chips from atheism, or you decrease their strength, or you add chips to theism, or you increase their strength. Same thing is said for the atheistic side. So what would take me closer to atheism? Well, you could add chips to the atheism side. You could increase their strength, or you could take away chips from the theistic side, or you could decrease their strength. So there are 4 different ways for each of those. So it's like 8 total ways that I could be influenced, essentially. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a general formula, right? So I mean, it makes sense too, right? Those seem to be exhaustive for me. I mean, I guess you could, well, personal experiences might count as, or for me, I think they would count as evidential chips, right? So personal experience is going to be included in that. So if I had some dramatically transformative religious experience or something, that could serve as a very strong evidential chip pushing me towards theism. And this is like a process of reflective equilibrium. I'm constantly trying to evaluate these sorts of things. It's very difficult. Um, but as I read new evidence and so on, as I read new papers that come out arguing for different theses, as I come up with new arguments on my own, different chips are added and things ever so slightly tip one way or another. Because I have a lot of chips on both sides, right? Usually it's only ever so slight tippings, right? So it doesn't really change from agnosticism, at least currently, because there are just a lot of chips on both sides, and I'm aware of a lot of the relevant moves in the debate. But ever so often we do get a pretty powerful chip. Right now, I'm wrestling with a wrestling, as in toying around with thinking about, really trying to come to grips with this new evidential chip for theism, which is an argument from Psychophysical Harmony from Dr. Dustin Crummett and Dr. Brian Cutter. It's a new paper that was published, I think, in Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion. I forget precisely where, but it's a new argument for theism. And so far, I've found it pretty pretty powerful. And I'm thinking it's like a Bayesian argument, right? So it's not like a deductive proof of God's existence or anything like that. But um, I have some reservations, but I'm trying to work through those. And so, that could be one thing that like might make me ever so, slightly leaning to like agnostic, leaning theist, right? So maybe that's the next move for me. Who knows? It just all depends, right? And I'll just see where the evidence and reasons lead me.
Yeah, no, I really like how you describe that process. I think the kind of the idea of chips and that there are kind of you can take one off, one could be added. I really think that's a great kind of analogy, and I think it's also so useful because it's a more nuanced perspective, and is rather like, yeah, well, I know exactly what argument would
Yeah,
shape me,
exactly.
you
Like
know
I don't know what I'll come across, and
yeah,
who knows?
yeah, and I appreciate how nuanced that is, because I feel I feel like that is what is missing in a lot of the pop sort of atheism, or maybe even the pop theism at times. Like it's this level of ambiguity, right? I mean, let's be honest, who likes ambiguity? I was reading Merleau-Ponty on phenomenology, and like, I'm somebody who kind of loves ambiguity because it's fun, it's unknown, it's there's a puzzle, and I love that. Um, but I just like that because I'm weird, right? The majority of people, they don't like ambiguity, rightly so, because it's unpredictable, because it's scary. Like, I agree, it's all of those things. But we have to, especially in philosophy, we have to, and like you do very well, admit where there is ambiguity and respect that fact, like you do with epistemology as well. Like, there's only so much we can know, and also we have to kind of be careful in the steps that we take to come to knowledge. Um, so, I do think that that's an important point. Um, yeah, I mean, personal experience intuitively seems to me, because I think, as Cameron Bertuzzi said before, like, is it? Yeah, actually, I think it was when he was talking to Alex O'Connor, but it was yeah, somewhere in there it was mentioned that nobody's really convinced by by like ontological argument, or or formal arguments, let's just say, or logical, deductive, inductive. Like, it seems to be more this personal, subjective kind of decision that is based
Vibes.
on experience, right? Yeah, and it's like, and I don't blame anybody for that in a sense, because we are, as I said, pattern seeing creatures, and I really love Otto Ranks. I've probably mentioned this too many times now, and viewers probably remember, but it's like, I just love this quote. It was featured in The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, and Otto Ranks said it. It was, we are theological creatures, not biological creatures, right? So by definition, we are receptive to experience, and we want to, well, most of us anyway, would reasonably want there to be, a loving creator, unless you're a misotheist or something. But I don't really see the logic, for the most part, in that, if we are going to, agree that there is a benevolent God, because that would not make sense. But yeah, no, I think all of this is, again, what I like with your content is that you pay attention, you you take it seriously, right? It's not flippant, and I just really appreciate that, because I've for so long, and I think many atheists might, because I'm an atheist myself, and I guess many, let's say, thinkers in philosophy come across the new atheists, and there comes a point. I know my friend Eric Evans, he's a Christian, and I think you've talked with him.
Yeah, wait,
Yeah,
hold on a second.
yeah,
Eric Evans, that sounds familiar. Is that like conscious philosophy, you
yeah,
said?
yeah, yeah. Conscious philosophy.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
I can't
He's
believe I remember that.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He's awesome. Yeah, yeah, and we talk about these topics quite a lot, actually, and I'm trying to think where I was going with that now.
Well,
It's
I just
just
want to say, I mean,
yeah,
if I could, take over a little bit
yeah, yeah,
there. So like, I mean, it's that's one also thing that I think is really important, is to have friends across ideological barriers, right? To have friends who are
Mm,
theists if you're an atheist,
agreed.
or if you're a theist, have like actual close friends who are atheists, and talk with them, like not combat with them, these sorts of like poo flinging exercises, but instead like serious, substantive, respectful, loving, virtuous conversations and friendships. Like it's really healthy, and it broadens your own perspective. It helps you see how other people view the world from their own like presuppositions and their own commitments and so on. And it also exposes you to new ways of thinking, and perhaps new arguments and new considerations that you otherwise would have been unaware of. Um, Sometimes people say that, oh, I can just, speaking as a theist or as an atheist, oh, I can just only read theist literature because, they're going to look at the objections from the atheist side, and they're,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'll get a balanced view. But like, no, you're not, because you're
Yeah.
not listening to the strongest proponents of the other view give
Mm,
the objections and respond to the responses of these other guys, and contrary-wise for the atheists, right? So it's like you need to be able to hear the other side from the other side, and not filtered through the lens of your own side, in order to have I should say, a less biased avenue and inquiry in critical thinking and reasoning. Now, I should say, like, I don't pretend to absolute objectivity. I don't pretend to being unbiased. We all have cognitive biases. We all have these sorts of heuristics by which we navigate the world and by which we navigate epistemic space. It's just something that we got to work to try to mitigate, right? At least try to cultivate the virtues as best as you can, to at least try to cultivate open-mindedness and receptiveness to alternative views. Just given our inbuilt human tendencies, we're not going to be perfect at it. We're going to have biases. We're going to favor certain views irrationally and so on, in certain positions and arguments. But at least we can try to mitigate that. And so that's also another thing. And one way to mitigate that is indeed to broaden your sources of information, including friends from the other side, as well as sources of information from the other side. Yeah.
I think that's a really underrated point, you know, because let's just think of Twitter and things like that, where it's low resolution kind of ideas for the most part. And, this, I think it's Jonathan McClatchy. I mean, he said that, I think he said to me that I found it quite funny at the time. He was like, YouTube is fast food philosophy, and I agree. But at the same time, it's very good fast food philosophy, and it's same with
Sometimes it's
Twitter
very
as
slow
well.
food philosophy if it's 12 hours long, but no.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wonder who does that. Yeah, yeah, and I kind of relate that to Twitter as well. I think I'm not as critical of YouTube as Jonathan might sound there.
Yeah.
But but yeah, I mean, Twitter is an example where a lot of people. Let's just for example, Twitter. A lot of people use that to kind of confirm their own beliefs, right? That they might follow, let's say politically, even one side, and they're like, they listen to them and they kind of cheer for them. But in the past couple of years, maybe three years, I've actually been following the opposite side, like you were kind of mentioning about philosophy, and when I started to do that, and also when I started to read the opposite side, that is when, for me at least, and I'm perhaps for you even, like that is where the true learning is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like you said, you very well pointed out, there's no straw manning here, like because you're directly talking to the person providing the proposition, right, or the idea, putting it forward. So I think that's just a fundamental point.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, go ahead, go
No,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, like even if like your own side isn't strawmanning the other side, like there's still something unique from just hearing like them present their best case and respond to your own side's like points and so on. Because firstly, your own side might extend the dialectic only so and so far, right? So there's an original argument, there's a response, there's a counter response, counter response, counter response. Maybe in your own side's presentation of it, like you're only presented to that point, right? And then maybe the video ends or the article ends and so on. Like if you listen to the other side, maybe the dialectic extends further. There's a response to this response that your side didn't present, and so on. Maybe because they're unaware, maybe they're not being like disingenuous or anything like that. And similarly, like even if your side, and so that doesn't require your own side to be strawmanning or anything like that. So even if your side is like perfectly virtuous and so on, like there are very likely going to be things that you're going to be missing if you don't listen to the other side, and considerations you're going to be missing. Another thing to keep in mind is that there have been like psychological studies where they take college students and they take the ones that have strong views on the death penalty, ones that are strongly for and strongly against, and they present them papers because in these sorts of disciplines you can always find at least some papers that support one side and support the other. I mean, oftentimes, like even in like climate science, right, you like it's going to be like 97% favoring anthropogenic climate change, but there will be those like 3% of papers that you can find, right? And so like if you present the papers that are against the person's pre-existent like strongly held views to those people, when they're asked to find flaws in the study, they look through it with extreme scrutiny because it goes against what they hold. So they'll like really try to seek out flaws and so on in the arguments. But what they found is that people who were given studies that confirmed their own beliefs, they didn't actually go through the studies with super duper scrutiny, and they overlooked lots of the problems that the other group found. And like they found this for both groups consistently across a bunch of different issues and so on. I forget which study precisely this is, or I think it's a collection of studies. But I was just listening to it the other day in some like audiobook or something, and I was like, whoa, like that shows that even like if you're listening from one side, like they're oftentimes going to be highly, highly critical of arguments that come in and so on that are against their own views. But when there are arguments that are propping up their own views, there are going to be objections that they're going to be missing, most likely, given the psychological research that we know of. So it's like, that's yet another reason. It's not just because, we are like biased or that things like that. I mean, I guess that's a sort of bias, but it's not just because your own side is vicious in some way. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's not because your side has the bad guys that you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's also just certain inbuilt tendencies of human beings that are gonna that give you reason to look at the other side.
Yeah, it's psychological predispositions, that aren't necessarily malicious, like you explain. I feel it's good also to have a perception of, let's say, the opposing or the opposite group or idea. I think it's a good idea to have a positive and constructive perspective of let's say if you're an atheist, it's good to approach a Christian with respect, and to hear what they have to say without kind of jumping in too soon, and hearing out what they have to say in even if it might be long-winded, which I have a tendency to be long-winded myself, but like it's always good to make sure you kind of have the whole picture rather than jump in when they're making the picture. You know what I mean? And it's just basic listening skills as well. When you say it's just basic listening skills. I mean, we have touched on this in what we just said, but I guess I would want to ask you directly the question: what do you think makes a good philosopher? Have you got any tips for somebody who is really interested in this topic and they want to kind of learn how to think more critically about topics without letting their presuppositions go too far? Like, what would you say in that regard? Maybe a book recommendation or two? I don't know.
It's very difficult. What does make a good philosopher? I mean, I think starting with like getting clear on, or really just trying to cultivate intellectual virtues first, just having the kind of love for the truth and open-mindedness and intellectual curiosity and intellectual perseverance and lots of these sorts of epistemic virtues that really serve as the foundation for critical thinking. I think those are important to nail down first. And like, how do you do that? Well, I mean, I talk about certain tangible tips in at least a few places. One of them is my discussion with Josh Rasmussen, how to discuss the nature of reality. That's one place that people can look. Another place that they can look is like in the first or second chapter of my book right here. I made it super duper cheap. I'm not trying to like plug or make money or anything, but I made it super duper cheap because I want it to be able to serve people as widely as possible. The Kindle version is like $1.99 or something like that, and then the book is like, I think it's $5.99 or something. And I talk about different ways to like view discussions, view dialectics, just like to go about the process of critical thinking in a way that is intellectually virtuous and to try to cultivate the intellectual virtues. So that's one thing that I think is super duper important, is like having a foundation of intellectual virtue, and at least trying to cultivate that to the best of your ability before, like jumping into these sorts of discussions. A second thing to do is, I mean, to be a good philosopher is like just to get, like, at least get reasonably proficient and knowledgeable on the basics of like the basics of each subdiscipline. So like, what is epistemology? What are some of the major debates in there? Like, hey, here's a major debate. What is knowledge? Is it justified true belief? And then, like just some of the basic moves. And nothing that it's like nothing over and beyond what you'd get in like a, pretty comprehensive introduction to like a single book or something like that. But like a good philosopher has at least a basic grasp of the foundations in most disciplines, because that helps alert them to the fact that this argument might be presupposing a controversial view in another area, right? Because if you know, like, at least the broad strokes, the views in different areas, you'll be more tuned to underlying assumptions in arguments and things like that. And that also includes knowing the basics of like argumentation. What's a valid argument? What's a sound argument, etc. How do we evaluate arguments?
Learning logic,
learning
I
logic.
found is
Logic
really,
is very
really important. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like knowing the basic inference rules of propositional logic, at least knowing how the quantifiers work. You don't need to be like a logician or anything like that. We're just talking like a basic kind of a basic foundational level, like know modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, like these sorts of things. And like know some of the central mistakes in reasoning that people make, like question begging, right? It's a common thing that people do when they assume in developing an argument, they might assume the very question at issue, or they may assume their conclusion at some step, or justification for some step might rest on a prior assumption of something that they're trying to argue for, etc. So like to know some of the central fallacies, mistakes in reasoning, try to develop critical thinking skills, try to develop intellectual virtue. And I mean, honestly, it takes moral virtue as well to engage in these sorts of discussions, like patience and etc. And know the basics of the discipline and like the subfields, as well as logic and so on. So I mean, that's a kind of recipe. Oh, and then pursue something that you're interested in a lot of depth, right? So maybe you're interested in the mind-body problem, and you could pursue that in depth, right? So once you've got like a grasp of the basics in every area, go to town on a particular area that you like. Maybe it's phenomenology, maybe it's philosophy of religion, maybe it's a particular argument. And no one's asking you to be an expert in anything, right? It's just, this is one way to become better in philosophy. So I guess recommendations here. I do have a book on critical thinking and philosophy. It does try to equip you with the tools and skills and so on. And like I said, it's really cheap. So it's right up there. It's called The Majesty of Reason, A Short Guide to Critical Thinking and Philosophy. You can find it on Amazon. And then other books, I guess I could just recommend checking out my video, What is Philosophy? I go through a bunch of different introductory books there. Yeah.
Isn't it like, is it a 35-minute sort of one? Or is it, I think it's around that.
I think it's close. I remember it not being super duper long. And for me, that's not super duper long. Right. So I remember it being roughly that. It's like, what is philosophy? And then the thumbnail, I think, says like, what is philosophy? And then it's got in the background, it's like got like a picture of Pythagoras or something.
Yeah. That's the one I was thinking of. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, yeah. Thanks for the obviously a lot of great stuff there. And I mean, I would, to a listener also thinking like, more books and things like that on logic. I read a really good one. I mean, an introduction to logic. It's called Informal Logic. And I think it was Matt Dillahunty actually who I watched, and there's like a book recommendation video that he made, and I picked that one up, and it was really good actually.
I think I know which one you're talking about, and I think that one's also pretty good. If I know which one you're talking about, and if I recall correctly, so
it's got like a blue cover, I think.
Yeah, I remember it being light blue or something.
Yeah. I found that to be just like really, really useful, and actually not boring as well. I mean, I like the topic, but I was thinking this is kind of close to maths, and I'm really bad at maths. So, and I was like, oh, Oh, good. Oh, good. It's written in plain English, and it's not maths at all, really. So,
Oh, that's another
uh,
thing that reminds me. Like a good philosopher doesn't require flowery, needlessly flowery language, like it
mm,
could just be simple, straightforward, and clear and precise, right? So, like, my argument is this, my first premise is this, my second premise is this, and my third premise is that. Now let's go through the justifications for each of the premises. Let's start with premise one. Here's my first justification for premise one. It sounds boring, right? But it's like it's very clear. It's very direct. Um, it's very understandable, precise. Like people know what you're arguing, and there's going to be little ambiguity there about what your argument is, what its justification is, and so on. If it's not that clear, you start to worry. What are they hiding, right? Are they trying to pull a rug out
yeah,
or whatever, or pull the wool over your eyes? I think that's what the metaphor that I was looking for. Or maybe that's not even a metaphor. See, I'm not an English major. I'm sorry.
I think it is. I think you're okay there.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Although
yeah.
if not, I'm sure there'll be
There
comments
are
correcting
always
everyone.
there are
Yeah.
always those commenters like, well,
Yeah.
actually, you said hyperbole. You meant a simile, or you meant a metaphor. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's like, um, hey, it's fine. Precision is important, but sometimes, it's dialectically improper. But to
Yeah.
point it out,
Well,
if it's irrelevant,
I'm sure you can get back to them in your 12-hour Q&As. It's
that's
cool.
true. That's true.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming on the channel and talking with me. We've covered a lot here, and I think that yeah, I just for anyone who's listening and who doesn't already watch Joe's channel, I just highly recommend it. It's so useful, and also, oh yeah, I really liked your book recommendations. I think it was your full book tour or something like that,
Oh
and
yeah,
I and
yeah.
I got a fair few noted
Let's
down
go.
from that one. So I'm kind of a sucker for book tours and book
As am I. Yeah.
showing. Yeah,
What's sad,
yeah,
just very briefly, what's sad is like, I said at the beginning of the video, but like still full. I mean, it's like a 0.5% of my books, because almost all of them are online nowadays. So it's like
true.
people really aren't getting a representative grasp, but it's still very helpful because it's a lot of books and they're all really helpful. So
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, yeah. So thank you once again for coming on the channel, and viewers, let me know what you think of what we said. Leave comments, and I'm sure Joe will get back to you.
we'll
In
see about that.
his, he will respond to each one. A man of the people. Yeah. So
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed this. So yeah.
yeah, I'll perhaps see you soon. All right. Thank you.